Hi, we're back. Yesterday I had to go because I had to bake cookies for Mr. Ball. Here they are. I wish I could share them with you. Here, take a bite. Super yummy snickerdoodles. They're good. I wish you could have one. I'll have to get you some when we come back to school. So today we're going to do chapter 14. So make sure you have your book and your writing utensils and your spiral or paper. Before we get started, I want you to write the word adage, A-D-A-G-E. And some of you may have heard of that word before. It's like a short phrase that has a particular meaning or a strong meaning or truthful meaning. And the adage that you'll hear in this chapter is two heads are better than one. And you've probably heard of that one before. And I want you to write about what you think that means after we read this, and you'll do a little writing assignment. So you're going to write adage, and then you're going to write about that at the end. Chapter 14, 75% of nothing. What is that? What is 75% of nothing? Yeah. No lunch recess. It was the only thing Greg really hated about sixth grade. After the kids finished eating, they had to dump their trays, sit back down, and wait for the bell. No walking around, no loud talking, and Mr. Percy, the custodian, was always there, leaning on his mop handle, watching. It reminded Greg of mealtime in an old prison movie. Mr. Percy was like the guard, always edgy until the prisoners were locked up in their cells again. What are they meaning by that? How are they relating prisoners to students? Are you guys locked up in a cell? Well, I sure hope you don't think that class is a cell, but that's how he's relating it. Except the convicts got to go out into the exercise yard every afternoon, and the sixth graders don't. You guys get to go to recess still in sixth grade, don't worry. Greg had done some thinking since third period, and he decided he ought to say something to Maura about her drawings. He hadn't actually lied to her in the hallway after social studies, but he had come close, and he remembered that hurt look she gave him as she shoved her pictures back in her face. Yes, Maura was annoying, and she was a copycat. And he was glad Mrs. Davenport had fixed it so she was going to see even less of her every day. Still, she had gone out of her way to ask his opinion about her drawings, and her excitement about the comic books seemed real. So why not tell her the truth about her artwork? It was the least he could do. And besides, it wouldn't cost him anything now that he couldn't sell comics at school. Greg knew that if he went over and tried to talk to Maura at her table, he'd be surrounded by girls. No way could he say what he wanted to with an audience like that. Plus, with Mrs. Davenport's orders to keep away from Maura, he didn't dare just walk up to her. So he ate fast and watched carefully, and when Maura got up to take her tray to the drop-off window, Greg made his move. His timing had to be perfect. It was, but Maura saw him coming. As Greg slipped into the short line behind her, he saw her shoulders stiffen. So he talked fast, his voice low. That thing in the office went okay, don't you think? I mean, it stinks not being able to sell comics anymore, but at least we didn't get in trouble. Not even detention. Pretty good, huh? Maura didn't turn, didn't nod, didn't react. Nothing. And look at the picture. Look at her face. She's got like a scowl, right? And he's kind of smiling, and they have their little lunch tray. So Greg took a deep breath and said, Listen, I didn't mean what I said. After social studies, when Eileen and Brittany came up, but you heard what they said, and it just what? Maura hissed, still keeping her back to him. Did that big, mean girl scare you? You couldn't have said something like, we're just talking, you know. Because you only made everything look worse, which is just what they wanted. Besides, who's stupid enough to even care about who those two think? Oh, I forgot. You are. Top of the next page, 129. If Maura wanted to trade insults, she was messing with the wrong guy. Oh, yeah, Greg said. Well, I'm what? Maura whipped around so fast that the empty milk carton flew off of her tray. Greg had the words. He could have hit her hard, but it wasn't what he wanted. He took a breath. Again, Maura demanded, I'm what? You're right, Greg said. What I did was stupid, and what I said was stupid, so I'm sorry. And then he bent down, picked up her milk carton, and tossed it into the recycling barrel, along with his own. Oh, Maura said. She was surprised he'd apologized, and also that he'd picked up her trash. She said, thanks, and then slid her tray into the conveyor belt. Greg said, you're welcome, and then he dumped his tray too. Again, paying attention to the dialogue here, and where the quotation marks go, and the commas. With his hands empty, Greg felt suddenly awkward. He missed having his red pencil case to hang onto. He stuffed his hands into his pockets. He said, "So, don't you want to know what I'm thinking this morning?" Turn your page, top of 130. "About your drawings? Before all that." Morris said, "Yeah, but only if you were going to say something good." And she turned and walked toward the crowd of kids at the dessert table. Greg followed her, glad that the noise and talking in the cafeteria seemed to be getting a little louder. The sound was like camouflage. He'd edged up next to Mara and said, "If you only want to know what was good, your drawings won't ever get better." She turned her head. Some of it was good. Really? Greg turned into her face to see if she was kidding. Her eyes didn't lie. Mara actually had no idea how brilliant her pictures were, and it struck him that this might be the first time he had ever looked into Mora's face when they hadn't been yelling at each other. He turned his face forward and took a step closer to the dessert table. Choosing his words carefully, he said, "I don't want you to get all conceited or anything, because your pictures, well, they're good. Maybe it's just beginner's luck or something, but I don't think so, because you got it. The whole idea of how pictures work in a comic, the timing of the panels in that scene, you just nailed it. Because it's different writing a comic than an actual narrative, right? Because you have the frames, is what they call them, the different sections. If your parents get a newspaper, some do, you could look in that at the comics. I know we've talked about that before." Greg sneaked a sideways look at Mara. Her cheeks, usually pale next to her blonde hair, was flushed with color. She was smiling slightly, trying not to, but smiling. He said, "There's more. Ready?" Mara angled her head his way. She wouldn't look at him in the face. She nodded. He said, "Okay, some problems. You know what scale is? In a drawing." Mara nodded, and Greg said, "So tell me." She said, "It's when you make sure things look like they're the right size compared to other things. Like if a unicorn looks like it's actually bigger than a tree, then the scale is messed up." And at the beginning of the year, I believe we talked about that with some of the work we were doing. Greg said, "Right, so in a couple of your panels, the scale was wrong, but only in a few. The truth is, they're amazing, just incredible." With something in her voice that sounded like fear, Morris said, "You're not just saying this, right?" Greg shook his head and said, "No." Then he said, "I mean, I'm not some big expert or anything, but I've seen a lot of comics and think your pictures are really good. Really." Without even looking Mara in the face, he could tell how much those words meant to her, and it seemed like she actually cared about his opinion. It was scary to feel how much power that gave him, and suddenly Greg felt kind of responsible, like he wanted to help her. It was an entirely new feeling. But Greg didn't let himself get carried away. His business mind kicked in, and in a flash he saw a way to be sort of helpful, and also to possibly make a little money. "So," he said, "how'd you like to make your whole unicorn story over into a comic book? And then print some copies, and then try to sell them, not at school, but there are other places. If you want, I could help, and your comic could be one of the chunky comics. And if any of them sell, you could even make some money, share in the profits. And if you come up with more story ideas, you could make more and try to sell them. What do you think?" Seemed like a decent idea to Greg, and a very generous offer. Without missing a beat, Morris said, "How much money would I get?" 40% of the profits on every copy, just on your comics, not mine," Greg added, again feeling generous. Morris shook her head. 75% for my own comics, and you don't get to tell me what my stories should be about or anything." They both took a step closer to the dessert table. 50%, said Greg, and he thought, "She is the bossiest, most annoying, most—" 75%, Morris said, "or else I'll just go ahead and figure out how to do it all by myself." Everything he did not like about Mora came crashing back into his mind, and Greg was tempted to shout, "Fine, go ahead and do it all yourself, you stupid, stubborn lump." But he wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing him get angry. Besides, they weren't going to sell many comics now, maybe none at all, and 75% of nothing is what, you guys? Nothing. So Greg said, "Deal, 75%, but you have to buy me an ice cream sandwich right now." Ooh, look at the picture. That looks good. Morris stepped in, laid 4 quarters on the dessert table, reached into the freezer, grabbed 2 ice cream sandwiches, and slapped one of them into Greg's hand. She looked him in the eye, cracked half a smile, and said, "Deal." 3 minutes later, as Greg sat at the regular table enjoying the last gooey bites of his free ice cream sandwich, the speakers crackled, and the PA system sounded. Silence settled over the cafeteria as Mrs. Davenport began to speak. Again, Greg thought of a prison movie. It was time for a few words from the warden. "Good afternoon, boys and girls, and good afternoon to all those teachers and staff. I'm sorry to interrupt class this way, but I have an important all-school announcement. Some of our students have been making small comic books and bringing them to school. I've looked at some of these, and they are not the sort of thing we want here at Ashworth Intermediate School. Also, I have learned that some students have been selling these little comic books to their friends right here at school. Even if these comics were appropriate, and they are not, even then, no one would ever be permitted to sell them at school. Our town school committee has a strict policy about this, so please listen carefully. Starting right now, I want all students and teachers to understand that these little comic books may not be brought to school, they may not be created at school, and they certainly may not be sold at school. Thank you all for your cooperation and have a productive afternoon. The chocolate wafers were Greg's favorite part of the ice cream sandwich, and as he chewed the last sticky bits from his left thumb, he thought, so that's that. The warden has spoken. Chunky Comics is now officially dead. And suddenly, Greg was surprised, startled, almost shocked. Not that Chunky Comics was dead. He'd known that this was going to happen. What amazed him was that he wasn't more upset about it. Besides, only yesterday he'd been shouting in Maura's face, all set to go Cro-Magnon on her because she was cutting into his profits. And today, his whole top of page 136, comic book empire was crushed. And all the money was swirling down the drain. And what was he doing about it? Eating ice cream. And Greg thought, what's wrong with me? I should be furious. I should be pounding on this table, shouting, unfair, unfair, unfair. But Greg didn't have a chance to think more deeply about this because at the moment the bell rang, everybody stood up. Mr. Percy began barking orders, and the inmates at the Ashworth Intermediate Security Facility started trudging back to their cells. Can you visualize that? They're making a connection between inmates and students. You guys, it's not that bad. After math class on Friday afternoon, Greg rushed out and went straight to the art room. He needed every possible minute to work on his wire sculpture. Maura took her time leaving room 27, and as she got to the door, Mr. Z called, Maura, just a quick word, please. She turned around, made her way through the other kids, and walked over to stand in front of his desk. Mr. Z started slowly. I just wanted to say that I feel like what happened yesterday between you and Greg was partly my fault. When Greg started yelling, I should have pulled him right out into the hall. Then all that mess wouldn't have happened, and you wouldn't have been called to the principal's office today, or been switched out of my class. And by the way, that was not my idea, so I wanted to say I'm sorry, and I feel like I've turned you two into worse enemies than ever. Maura shook her head and said, It's okay, really. Things are better now. I mean, it's not like Greg and I are friends or anything, but we're sort of in business. We've got a deal and everything. I'm going to make comic books for Greg's company. Mr. Z's dark eyebrows went up. Greg's company? Well, that's good news. Great. He smiled and didn't seem to know what to say next. So, Morris said, can I go now? I can't be late for language arts again. Of course, Mr. Z nodded. Go right ahead and have a good weekend. You too, Mr. Z. After Maura was already out the door, Mr. Z called, and if you two want any of my advice, I know some economics and accounting. Business stuff. Turning your page to 138, Maura called back. Thanks. Earlier during lunchtime, Maura Shaw had listened to the announcement from the principal, and she heard the same words Greg had heard. But for her, Chunky Comics wasn't dead. It was just coming to life. She intended to make Greg keep his word. He wasn't going to help her turn The Last Unicorn into a real comic book, whether he actually wanted to or not. And Maura couldn't wait to get started. Oh, I was thinking they had the adage part in that two heads are better than one. So I want you to write, why do you think it would be better for Maura and Greg to work together on their business? Tell me what you think the positive things of that would be. Tell me what you think might be some struggles that they could have, maybe that they don't get along sometimes. Maybe just a paragraph. Tell me your thoughts. Organize it how you want. Just tell me what that means and how it relates to the story. And I will see you back next time. Love you. Bye.